It is July 1st, 2013, and my name is Nancy Bogdatris, and I am here at the LGBT Center in Harrisburg interviewing Marlene and Kanuck. Even though I just said your name, would you say your name?
Marlene Kanuck.
And what is your date of birth, and where were you born?
January 4th, 1949, Hayes, Pennsylvania.
And what are your parents' names?
John, spelled differently, John Kanuck and Mary Kanuck. My father, he would go by Reverend John.
And what was his profession?
He was a Lutheran minister.
All his life.
Mm-hmm.
And what about your mother?
My mom was a housewife and a pastor's wife, which is a full-time job.
And any siblings?
I have an older sister who's almost 6 years older than I am, and she lives in Minneapolis, in the suburbs of Minneapolis.
And her name?
Lydia?
And no other siblings?
No.
And how long have you been living here in this area?
The Harrisburg area?
The central Pennsylvania area.
Since 1989. I moved to Lancaster in October of 1989 for a position with the Intermediate Unit 13, initially in their alternative education program, and then took a job with the state, which I was sort of waiting to go through anyways, at the Department of Education in December of the same year, and I've been there ever since.
And when you moved here, where did you move from?
From the Pennsylvania area, where I lived from 1965 until I moved here.
And where did you go to school?
I'm chuckling because there's a lot of schools. When I was 3 years old, my father took a church in Minneapolis, in South Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I grew up there. So I went to a elementary school that was about 2 blocks away from my home, and then to a junior high school that was a little further away. Went to high school that was a private high school. It was a very small Lutheran high school. In my sophomore year, transferred to a larger high school that was actually run by the Covenant Church. Although it was pretty strict there, I loved the high school and I loved the environment. And then fortunately or unfortunately, my father decided to take a church in Sharon, Pennsylvania between my junior and senior year. And so I graduated from Hickory High School in Hermitage, Pennsylvania. So it's 3 high schools in 3 years.
Wow.
It makes for being able to get along socially pretty easy once you go through that.
I'm going to tell you, talk to her.
Yeah.
Because what happened, I'll explain why. In video, we don't like people's eyes to shift back and forth.
Okay.
How about beyond high school?
I went to Teal College, which is a Lutheran college in Greenville, Pennsylvania. It's about 10 miles from my home, but not because I wanted to go there. There was a lot of disappointment in my life when I couldn't return to Minneapolis to finish my senior year, and so there was a lot of rebellion on my part when I was a senior in high school, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. All my life I wanted to go to college because I wanted to be a doctor, but I was upset by this move that for the first time in my life my grades went down, and so I started applying finally to colleges, and then I decided I wanted to go to the college that my father went to, Muhlenberg. And found out in 1966 I couldn't be accepted there because all the tests I had were from the Midwest, and they knew nothing about the school, nothing. And this last school I went to was so academically high and achieving that even to get into the school, you had to have a high achievement and to be accepted. And then I was doing so well, I was even testing in the National Merit Scholarship testing. And it just kind of things slid down. So then when I applied to Muhlenberg, they told me if I had been a boy, they would accept me. My scores as a girl.
Well, did they explain why, though? That wouldn't have mattered if you had been a boy?
Probably because the school had only been co-ed for approximately 5 years. And I think they were still pretty well trying to keep out as many females as they could. So then I ended up applying at Penn State and got accepted at the main campus. And my father wanted me to go there. So he said that was the place I was going to go to college, at Teal. And I rebelled, I guess, again, and I started dating an older fellow from the church and ended up eloping and getting married to him April of my freshman year. So I had had it by then.
Okay, April of your freshman year of college.
College, right. So that would have been 1967 in
Okay.
April. I handled it pretty well. So.
Okay. We ready? Now, you say you got married your freshman year to an older...
Yeah, he was, Steve was 27, I was 18, just had turned 18, because when I graduated from high school, I was 17.
Were you still living at home at the time?
Living at college, in the college dorm, which was probably the first time that they ever experienced somebody eloping out of one of their dorms. Leave it to a minister's kid. And so then I spent very few months when we were initially married, and then I went on to go to Allegheny Community College in Pittsburgh. His job was, he was a physical education teacher and in the Pittsburgh area. And so I went to that, and that was a community college that was just starting out. Community colleges really were pretty new at that time. And went there, and the following year, did well there, but the following year he was asked to interview for a position at Slippery Rock University, then Slippery Rock College, as as the head gymnastic coach. He got the appointment, and we moved to Slippery Rock, and I finished.
So you finished your degree at
I
Slippery
finished
Rock.
my degree actually it was in biology, natural sciences, biology, chemistry, pre-med.
And are you a member of a church?
Not really. I had been going to one of the supportive churches here in town for quite a number of years, and it just wasn't clicking, so I decided to start looking at other churches, but I really hadn't decided on a particular church.
Well, had you gone to a church when you were going to college and when you first got married?
Well, I certainly went, yes. Actually, I do, I guess officially on paper, I still belong to my father's church in Hermitage, Pennsylvania. My father went there to build a new church in '65 and completed it in '67. It's a gorgeous, large Lutheran church in Hermitage, and because my daughter lives in Hermitage or in that area, I still have membership in that church and still contribute, and particularly in honor of it. So, but I don't. The other churches I go to around here are just kind of hit and miss.
Okay. Well, we'll be coming back to religion, but let me ask you, you mentioned your daughter. The next question would have been, how many children, if any, do you have?
I have 2 children. I have a daughter who is 42 and lives, as I said, in that Sharon area, and someone who's 36 and lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, just relocated to Raleigh, North Carolina, from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
And what are their names?
Stephanie, Susan, and Mark Andrew.
And how long were you married to Steve?
I was married officially on paper 15 years. However, I left him after 11 years. The marriage was just not working out. It was pretty emotionally abusive as far as I was concerned, and I decided that this just wasn't working for me. I mean, I had tried leaving many times before that, and for various reasons I would come back. It's hard to leave a marriage. I mean, first time, it was probably when I already had my daughter, and I think it's hard to leave with a young child. But I eventually got pretty disgusted and decided to, even with the 2 children, decided to. And at that time, Mark was 2, not quite 2 or 2, and Stephanie would have been about 7.
And did you remarry after that?
No,
And do you have any grandchildren?
1 brand new baby girl, and I just adore her. Her name is Kennedy.
And when was she born?
She was born December 15th, 2019. That's my kids, 2012.
All right, so she's about
6 months old, yeah.
All right, now we're going to talk about your occupation for a while. What was the first occupation you had after you finished college?
The very first occupation, or do you consider it just a small job, or really when you were
Really
working?
full-time work.
Full-time work, okay, because I had a few things. Right, the first really, when I graduated from college, initially I didn't have any education credits because, again, I had intended all along to go to medical school, but my ex-husband decided to try to talk me out of that I would be with a family to be teaching. So I went along and decided to get education credits, and I graduated in January 1971, and student taught after I graduated, actually, because I had my daughter in April of that year. So we sort of graduated together in a sense. And then after that, in 1974, I got a teaching job at a rural school district out in western Pennsylvania, northern Butler County, teaching biology. And it was a small school district, and the school was 7th through 12th grade. So I would have always biology classes, but then whatever else they needed to teach also. So it could be life science, physical science, ecology, senior science. I taught all of them along the way, but always bio too.
And how long were you a teacher?
I was there until 1989.
And that's when you relocated to this area?
Right.
And what is your current occupation?
I work at the Department of Education here in Harrisburg. I started working there in December 1989, all these dates, 1989, and I currently am in charge of a grant called the Accountability Block Grant, which is this year was just refunded, meaning we're already in the next fiscal year. So our past fiscal year was $100 million, and it's $100 million budgeted for this coming fiscal year that we're in now, 13-14.
How many years have you been with the department?
24 in December. Long time.
And do you have any plans to retire soon?
Oh, that's a question a lot of people ask me. Yes, I keep trying to max out my retirement. I kept in a system, which the teacher system, and 40 years is the maximum that you can work beyond that, but you don't gain anything financially. So probably will retire soon.
All right. Did you serve in the military at all?
No, I didn't.
All right. Then
I did look into it, though.
Really? Go
I
ahead.
looked into military after I left Steve and after I got my divorce, and I had custody of the kids. And at that time, this would have been 1980, the divorce occurred in 1981. So it's probably around 83, 84, somewhere in that time, that you could not, as a woman with children, you could not join the military unless you were willing to turn over custody to the father of the children, full custody. And so I couldn't say, my parents who took care of the kids when I was working couldn't continue taking care of the kids. And since I had already been through an ugly custody case that he brought about for not really any good reason other than I was a full-time teacher, and he as a college professor worked less hours than I did, after that, I wasn't about to go over and turn the kids over.
Yeah, that would be a lot to ask. Did you, and currently, do you have memberships in any community organizations or fraternal societies, professional organizations?
Not really professional organizations, but a lot of community organizations. I'm very active in the community and have been since I moved to Harrisburg area. Actually, Lancaster. When I lived in Lancaster, Mark was pretty young. He was only in 8th grade. So I lived there from the time he was in 8th grade. He graduated in 1995. And finally in 1997, I moved to the Harrisburg area. That's when I started getting more and more involved. There was an organization, a women's organization, which they called a professional women's organization. That was a lesbian organization. That was kind of like a potluck organization.
Do you remember the name?
I think it was called that. I think it was just called Professional Women's Organization because it was almost like it was code, you know, because and that's how we would meet together. Most of the time it was women from Harrisburg. I knew some other women in the Lancaster area, but not many. And so then when I moved here, I started getting involved with Planned first. I was asked, I met people through my work actually. I was planning a conference and met Sharon Potter, who started Common Roads here at the center, and she in turn introduced me to somebody else, Nan Spears, who asked me if I would go and join Fund for Choice, which is an organization that raises funds for women that can't afford abortions. And so I joined that, and I was involved with that 10 years. And in those 10 years. And in 10 years, I chaired the Fund for Choice for 3 years. And I also ended up then serving on the Susquehanna Valley Planned Parenthood board, and then we merged with Northeast. I served on that board, the larger organization, so to speak. I also got involved in the center before it was a center. When I was working at the department, I had met, I guess I had met Ted Martin somehow, because he in turn told Carol Riesinger, who was executive director of Common Roads at that time, if she wanted some help somehow with maybe funding, that she should get a hold of me at the department. And I was involved at that time, Safe Schools money, and what they call the Student Assistance Program. So Carol did call me, and ended up getting very involved with teachers training, counselors training, school nurses on LGBT youth, and so that they were more, because what Carol found out is, from experience, that there was no education on that topic for those folks in school districts.
What year would that have been?
That would have been in in the late 90s, very late 90s or early 2000s.
Now training at Sourcen about LGBT issues. Were you doing that as an employee of the Department of Ed or as a volunteer common road?
Actually, I didn't do the training itself. What I did is I came up through my boss, and came up with the funding for the training. Common Road didn't have any funding. And I also had access to databases of teachers and school nurses. So I worked with Carol and actually to put together, to put on all the registrations, with all the Act 48 credits for the registrations. So it was co-sponsored by Common Roads and the Department of Education. We paid for all the lunches for the participants. And Carol was the one that found it up in Wheaton College in Massachusetts, Murphy, who booked the curriculum in 10th grade. It was one big training. And when we got there, school districts are going to out for this. They're just saying no, gay kids, all of that. And we, with participants, we had an overspend. We ended up, during that time frame, training altogether like 700 people.
That's how many school districts? It's 101, Pennsylvania?
They worked together. But I couldn't tell you, I couldn't remember, but it was probably in this area, certainly, because we kept having trainings and trainings. I don't know how many exactly over the 2 years that we ended up, but it was a lot, it was really the number of people that wanted to come to the place.
And when you first presented this to your boss at work, you didn't meet any resistance, or he himself wasn't someone higher up over him that might be by this?
Actually, it was a woman, and so it probably wasn't surprised that I would be working and supportive of an organization that gave safe space to young LGBT youth. So, and she thought it was a good idea because of, there were so many statistics about youth and the harassment and the bullying, particularly for that particular group of kids, and plus that they're 3 to 4 times more likely to commit suicide. That I think it was in part of the student assistance program, a health component, and I had been working with Myrna, who was my boss. I'd been working with her on a youth suicide prevention plan in Pennsylvania. It was just a natural part of it. So no, there was no resistance at all.
Who was governor at that time?
When I first initially started, it was Casey, so it was probably Ridge.
Okay. Now,
Who followed Ridge?
I believe Rendell.
Yeah, I think it was probably somewhere it was either in the Ridge administration or the Rendell administration. But there was money for safe schools, and it was still coming from the federal government at that time.
All right. Now, I want to now focus on your own sexuality. When did you first realize?
Can I go back and
yes,
go back and fill in organizations? Cause,
yes, you have
really,
organizations. Yes.
Planned Parenthood and Fun for Choice were just an early. I think it was not only because I believed in it very much. In the organization, because I faced a dilemma at one time when I got pregnant with my son and didn't know if I could handle. I knew I was going to handle 2 kids, but the point is that I believe that women needed that choice, and so they threw me 2 organizations, and then I got involved with an organization, a women's organization called the Women's Circle, that was organized by Bobby Carmichael, who lives over in Lancaster County, and I was on the board of that organization for a while. And the main thing that they did is a fall retreat for women that they could come to and have a good time, have workshops. It was just a great bonding experience. And then after that, I got involved with, there was a focus group that met discussing them. The foundation actually, I think initially was about that we know about the survey, but I went to the meeting that they were going to have this focus group that says, well, now these are the results of the survey, and the consensus was they needed a center.
What foundation was this?
The Foundation for Enhancing Communities.
All right.
So, so then what came out of that meeting is the fact that they needed a small group of people to take it from that point and put together draft bylaws and talk about board, particularly board members, and come up with board, because there was specific guidance from the group that it should come from all the areas, like all the different counties, 8 counties. They all should be balanced in all different respects, you know, through the LGBT should be balanced in that respect. Should be balanced geographical, as far as what kind of where people came from work-wise. So they asked for volunteers, of course, you know, and people volunteered. Martin and Ben Dunlap and David Swifka, and then they were going to leave it at that. And I'm not very shy, so I raised my hand and said, "Excuse me, I think there's an L in that center name." And so, if there is, then I don't think 3 guys, as great as they are, can do this and represent the lesbian voice. And so they said, "Well, fine, if you're going to say that, will you join them?" And I said, "I never say anything unless I'm willing." And so I did. And so really the 4 of us met for almost 2 years to form the whole basis or foundation for the center.
For this center.
For this
that
center.
we're sitting in.
At that time we were just meeting and we formed a board, and I think we were initially met down on in Ben's office building down across from where Mike the flower guy works.
Downtown Harrisburg.
Yeah, downtown Harrisburg area. And so, you know, and we came up with names for board members, and I mean, it was a lot of hard work. You know, we joke about it sometimes now, because we would meet over at a little restaurant over on North Street, and but the other day, as Doma went down, I looked at a couple guys and I said, "You know what? Because there was 100 people here celebrating, and I said, this is what it was all about. This was all those nights." So I'm also on the women's chorus board. I was asked 3 years ago to be on that board. I'm vice president of the Central Pennsylvania Women's Chorus, and a year ago I was asked to be on the Harrisburg Gay Men's Chorus board.
That's not a conflict of interest?
So, no, not at all. Actually, initially I was a little hesitant because I didn't know a lot of the guys well, but I've come to really love them. They are so well organized. Sometimes it's a relief. Their meetings are well organized, and their whole, the way they operate their whole organization is extremely good. So, not at all.
I'm going to ask you just to flesh out a little bit the years for this actual center, because you said it was essentially in the planning stage since about when, 1998?
No, it was it was further than that. It was like in the mid-2000s. I knew you were going to ask me dates, and I don't even have dates in my mind anymore.
Well,
I think I think that those initial board meetings, or when we were initially meeting, must have been 2003.
And then when did the center, what year did the center actually come to occupy?
Oh, this is a year.
Space?
This is a year. Yeah, because at first there was a lot of discussion on the board on whether to have a physical space. We were renting space on Front Street at the Episcopal Church for common roads. The problem is it wasn't like a lot of meeting space. It was enough space for the kids, and it was enough space for maybe small committee meetings and stuff. But it really wasn't even. I mean, it wasn't even conducive to the board meeting there, and it wasn't handicap accessible on top of it. So some of us on the board wanted to kind of charge ahead for a physical space, and I think there was a lot of hesitation because it's a big chunk to bite off when you talk about a physical space. And I have to kind of really give credit to our new president, Stewart, because, and he's not new, but
Stuart, what's his last name? Landon?
Yeah, Stuart Landon. That, because he's the one that sort of, when he came on as president, kind of said, this is what we need to do, and I think it was a young, new face, and it kind of gave us old timers a kick in the pants that we needed to forge ahead.
And as you said, when the Supreme Court decision was handed out last week, there were approximately how many people here celebrating?
I heard over 100. I heard around 100. It was open from 8 to, I think, 10. So, and I wasn't here the entire time, so. But when I walked in holding a pizza, I had to hold it above my head to get it in, so.
Well, that must have been a great moment, not only for the decision, but the fact that this place existed.
I think what was apparent that night very much is that when something happens, the people think of the center first. And that's exactly what the whole idea behind having a center in Harrisburg was. It's that we are the premier umbrella place to be. And
clearly you played a very integral role in that.
I think so. I'd like to think so.
All right. If we have gone through the organizations now, I would like to go back to turning the attention to your own sexuality. And my first question would be, when did you first realize you were a member of the LGBT community, and which do you identify as?
Definitely a lesbian.
When did you first realize?
When I should have realized, or when I did
When you did.
It's a kind of a strange story, I guess, in a way, or people would think it was a strange story. Because a straight man brought me out, and I think that's kind of unusual. And this was not in a negative way, but a very positive way.
Can you explain?
After I'd left my marriage, because I didn't leave it for any other reason other than what I perceived as differences, irreconcilable. How do you say that? You're an attorney.
Irreconcilable.
Yeah, well, differences, yes. And I perceived as emotional abuse. That I just kind of, first of all, I had to find a place to live because he wasn't moving out of the house. And so I found a place near my parents because my children were so young, and my work was quite a distance, the school, and I didn't want to put anyone I didn't know in charge of the children. So I lived in Sharon, and I started going to young single group, for single heterosexual people to meet, after a while, maybe after a year or so. And I met a woman there that was also divorced, had a couple kids almost the same age as my kids, and we got to be very good friends. In turn, we met a couple fellows that were also good friends. And one of them, actually they were both named Bill, and so we dated the Bills, and I became close to one, and Bill and I decided to move in together because the divorce wasn't coming. Steve kind of decided to fight the divorce, and at that time you had to wait 3 years if it was a unilateral divorce in Pennsylvania. So, so we decided to live together, and somehow during that time period, as I said, the two couples were very close. We did a lot of things together, and Bill said one night to me that he asked me if I ever thought I was gay. And I said, no. I mean, I was just even shocked that he brought it up, because I hadn't. And he said, I said, well, why? And he says, because I think you're in love with Ann. And I probably was, but I wasn't ready to admit it. And so I think what happened is that I had to really think about that. But he was not. He was just presenting it as like, did you ever consider this? You know, I'm not angry. I'm not, you know. But I think then I finally was. I think when I finally decided of a label, I decided I was bisexual, because I was living with him, and certainly I had feelings, affection for a woman. So, but then I started looking in hindsight, and I mean, hindsight's 20/20. I mean, for God's sakes, I could have gone back to certainly junior high school of crushes, and sometimes they say girls go through that, but there was sometime, particularly my senior year in high school, that I definitely had a lot of fantasies about my best friend in high school. Female friend, yes. So, but I think what I realized is I didn't have the words. I didn't have anything to know how to acknowledge, or I had never heard the word gay when in respect to a woman. The only time I even ran into the word gay in respect to a man is that we had a student pastor at our church who later, we stopped in, this is when we would travel, my family, this is mom, dad, and me, because my sister was so much older, she was pretty well out of the house pretty early. But we would travel back and forth from Minnesota to Pennsylvania to visit relatives. And one time stopping in Wisconsin where this pastor and his wife lived, and it was all hush-hush, because Tom had left, and then it was Tom had left because he was gay, and Tom had left because he was a minister, so it was all negative. So I didn't even, if I had any knowledge of the word, it was only through that, was negative, and I certainly had never heard of women being together, you know. Even though you have feelings, you have fantasies, you don't know how to put that together. So I think that was, even though I was 30, I think, and this was in 1982, it would have been 1982, that I finally said, well, maybe I should find out, you know. And the surprising thing is that Bill was, this sounds funny too, was willing to help me find out or explore this.
Very supportive guy.
And mostly what he did is, I said, like, how do you meet women? Like, how do I know? I mean, I didn't know anything. And it wasn't like Ann. Ann was very straight. And so that wasn't, you know.
That wasn't going to happen.
It wasn't going to happen, exactly. That wasn't going to happen. So I said, what do you do? And he said, well, I think it's the bars. That's the only thing, because that's what people only knew back then. And so we would, you know, we'd go to the bar in Youngstown, Ohio, or we'd go to the bar, found out where one of the bars were in Pittsburgh, and we'd go down there. So it's kind of funny, because when you go to a bar with a young, he said he was a young, good-looking, baby-faced blonde. So he said he'd only go with me on one condition, is that I'd protect him. And I wouldn't let anybody try to pick him up. So I said, okay. So one time we were at a bar in Pittsburgh, and I remember a guy approached him and said, asked him, was kind of like coming on to him, and I said, no, you can't do that, he's mine. And he said, well, what do you mean he's yours? I said, don't ask me, he's just mine. So it was kind of a fun time. But what ended up happening, and I did end up meeting somebody, and while I was still living with Bill, actually she was another teacher at my school. But I think what I realized soon after that was just short, very couple months, mostly in the summer, is like as August approached and that didn't work out, I said that I had decided that it just wasn't fair to him. That I knew this was going to be my journey now. And no matter how much we loved each other platonically, it wasn't fair to him. He needed to be able to find someone that loved him in a relationship. And I did too. So I found an apartment and decided to kind of go on my journey. And he helped me move, and that's what happened.
Oh, okay. So when did you have your first, I'd say, long-term relationship or committed relationship?
I met some committed relationship. I met initially.
Well, in other words, not someone just for the weekend or, when did you first get into a relationship?
Not a one-night stand.
Correct.
I'm not going there. First, I moved to Slippery Rock. I decided to move to Slippery Rock. Now, we were living in Newcastle, if you know Western Pennsylvania. They're very small towns, a lot of them. And so I moved. It was like ending up, what was kind of ironic, is I ended up where I started out. Because I was back in Slippery Rock now. And although I should have been a little afraid at that time to be in Slippery Rock because of my ex-husband being there, I guess I thought that was one of the places I could meet women because it was pretty well known, quote unquote, known, is that Slippery Rock had a lot of gay women going to college there because I was a professor's wife there from 68 to 78, 10 years. I even knew some of the women professors that were gay. So it was, I figured, well, if I was going to meet somebody, that there was a whole crew of people there to meet. And so I thought that would be the easiest place to meet someone. And what I found out is, although I think a lot of people, a lot of women who met me and found out that I had come out, thought it was kind of maybe a kick in the pants to a very heterosexual, chauvinistic male on campus,
Meaning your
professor,
ex-husband.
meaning my ex-husband, that they also were very closeted, which I didn't realize how closeted they were at that time, but they were. So it was among the faculty, people, they were open, but not outside that. And, it was a big risk for them, too, if Steve found out. So I didn't meet anybody there, And so, but I started getting in, there's a bar in Ford City at that time, and I went down there and ended up meeting somebody who kind of targeted the new kid on the block. So I started dating this one woman, and the thing is, it was a good relationship, but I think it was a good timing for both of us because Mark was in kindergarten and it was only half time, and so I needed somebody to take care of him, and I didn't want to move back to the Sharon area. So, and this woman that I met, her name was Sheila. She, at that time, was unemployed. They laid off staff from the steel mill. She was a foreman at the steel mill, and so she would pick him up she'd take care of them. She'd get them dressed in the morning and get them to school and pick them up and take them. And she's what I call a soft butch or a baby butch. And Mark had a great time with her, you know, that year. I mean, you know, from teaching her, she used to draw Smurfs for him, and you know, I'd come home and dinner was there, and teach him how to catch a ball and do all these things with him, you know. So it was good in that way. But just like she spotted me, she spotted somebody else by May, and so that was that. So.
Okay. Now you mentioned obviously in the little town of Sharon and Newcastle there weren't any gay bars. I think you said you had to travel like to Youngstown, Ohio.
The closest gay bar was Youngstown, Ohio, or the other popular bar was Ford City, outside of Ford City, Pennsylvania, by Pittsburgh, or going all the way into Pittsburgh. There were some bars there, which was a little far, not at least initially when you were just, you know, trying to find places. Actually, I wasn't happy with the school system. This ties into why I moved again. I wasn't happy with the public school system because Mark had gone to a Montessori daycare, and he was just like bored silly in kindergarten, no matter what I would do to talk to the teachers. And so I had decided to put him in a private school. And when you talk private schools in Western Pennsylvania, the only kind of private school you talk is Catholic school, parochial school. But since I had gone to private schools that were religiously based, that didn't present a problem to me. It was more the academic rigor that I was after. And lo and behold, it didn't present a problem to my father either, even though it was Catholic. He didn't have a problem with Mark going there. So that's when I decided to move back to the Sharon area so Mark could go to a very good Catholic school there. And the day I enrolled him in the Catholic school, I met the new principal of the Catholic school. And I didn't know much about Catholic schools other than academically. And so I still thought all Catholic schools were run by nuns. I mean, what else, you know? I go back to my experience. And what ended up happening is that night I was walking into the bar in Youngstown because my mom would babysit, and I walked in to go out. It was August. And lo and behold, walking out of the bar was the new principal of the Catholic school that I had just enrolled my son. And I said, "Excuse me, I think we just met." And I think she was a surprise because I had children, and that wasn't in her experience, and she wasn't a nun. She was just laid off from teaching here in this, actually further east, eastern Pennsylvania, in the Chester County area. So had taken this job because she couldn't find a job, you know, and she had very good credentials. And so that started the first long-term relationship I was in.
All right.
So I was in a long-term relationship with my son's principal. So.
Okay, I want to talk now about the impact of you coming out. Now, you have suggested, at least, that you probably were fairly closeted over there in that time period in those little towns, Sharon, Newcastle. When do you feel that you came out? And then let's talk about the impact on different aspects of your life.
Well, the thing is, I grew up in Minneapolis, which isn't Minneapolis is, well, it was just starting to be an up-and-coming area. And I was I never considered myself a typical teenager anyways, growing up in Minneapolis, because I was interested in things that I didn't think typical. I mean, some typical things like you like to go downtown when you're a teenager and go shopping and all of that stuff. But I had a very good friend who I'm still friends with in Minneapolis, that we went through junior high and high school, not in the same high school, but we only lived a block away. We became very close friends. And she also liked these things, which is what I'm saying is the Guthrie Theater, and going to see theater, going to see plays, going to see singers that weren't on the radar of teenagers, such as Sammy Davis Jr., going to see things like Henry Mancini and Franny and Taisha playing out at what used to be, now is the Mall of America, but that used to be the baseball stadium where that is. And they had music under the stars. And those kind of things that wasn't typical, you know. And so I had a lot of exposure to the arts. But, so I don't consider myself closeted, but closeted as far as anything to do with gay and lesbian. And so then when Sharon, oh my God, Sharon, it's like the first time I ever saw Sharon, I thought my dad had lost it to come to that place from Minneapolis, because it was like, where do you go for culture, you know? So I really was in that area. But that would have been, I moved there in 65, I came out in 82, so, and that time I really didn't know anything.
Now, when you say you came out in 82, did you come out, meaning did you tell your parents? Did you tell close friends?
When I was living with Sheila, no, I didn't tell my parents. The coming out experience, I think when I read about the coming out experience, I think you really do go through it in stages. I mean, the first stage is definitely coming out to yourself. And I definitely went through that. Then I think you go through, I felt you go through an adolescent period again, because all of a sudden you're in a dating, a dating type of, where you've never been. All of us, I was used to dating men. I was used to going out with men, but I certainly had no experience in like, well, how do you start here, you know? So it's like almost starting your youth all over again. So I think that's coming out in essence. So then when I was living with Sheila, when sometimes we would go down to the bar on a Saturday night, again, my mom would babysit. So, and all we would say is, oh, we're just going to a bar down in Pittsburgh. And so who knows where she was, put two and two together. And my mom was pretty with it anyways. She grew up in Europe and near Vienna. And I think, back in, I would say, the 30s in Europe, the late 20s and early 30s, it was probably a lot, from what I've read historically, it was certainly not unheard of for women to have women lovers. And so I think one time I was there in Sharon, and she asked me, my mom didn't drive, and asked me to go and take her to a store, which my dad usually did, to pick something up. It was an excuse because on the way home, she asked me why we always went to Pittsburgh, that there were plenty of nightclubs here in this area, in Sharon, and believe it or not, there was a nightclub in Sharon. And I said, oh, I don't know, we just like them. And I'm sitting there driving, and my mother all of a sudden said, it's a gay bar, isn't it? And I think I wasn't quite sure what to do, because I really hadn't prepared myself for either one of my parents to just come out and ask me. I figured they'd just sort of ignore it or something. And as I held on to the steering wheel and looked straight ahead, I decided well, what am I going to do? I could either lie about it, or I could just be done with it and just tell her. And I said, yeah, it is. Yes, it is. And so my mom, that was coming out to my parents, at least my mother. And then she really didn't say much. But what I had found out later is she immediately called my older sister to find out what the heck's going on here, and what, to talk to her about it, and what should we do with your little sister now that she's now doing something else. And my sister, although we're not close at that time, she probably gave my mom the best advice anybody had ever given my folks, and that is leave her alone. She's probably happy for the first time in her life. And so that was coming out. Although my mom did go through, are you sure we can't get you a psychologist or a psychiatrist? And I said, no, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm happy. So that was just a brief question. But it was a little harder on my father.
I was going to ask you next.
Yeah,
about
it was.
Yeah. You were saying about your father, that was much more difficult than your mother's reaction.
Well, I think my dad had a lot of internal conflict with me being gay. I'm not sure how long afterwards. I mean, it wasn't like months or something. It was like within weeks that I was over their place, and I remember sitting in their kitchen and sitting across the table from my dad, which is where we usually sat, each of us. You kind of end up having the same seats all the time in a family. And I remember my dad saying, he had to play the minister first, because he was my minister also, So he looked at me very sternly and he said, well, you realize you're going to go to hell, don't you? And I looked at him equally as serious and said, well, you don't have to worry, because you didn't cause it, and it'll be me going, not you. And I think it was just like the smartest thing I could have done, because it lifted the guilt off his shoulders. My dad wanted a boy all his life, wanted a son. I think my parents lost a son in between, although they were never specific about that. People just didn't talk in their generation. And I know, it was I consider a cruel family joke that I wasn't a boy, and it was no uncertain terms that was joked about, well, John, we can't put her back because you got a girl, but I try to make up for that, because it was very obvious to me at a very young age to try to be the boy my dad wanted. So I was very much of a tomboy. My personality lent itself anyways, but on top of it, I even wanted to, because I wanted to be accepted by my dad so much. So I think he thought maybe that was playing into this, the gay thing with me, and that's why I was gay. I was a lesbian. And I had to lift that burden from him. And I think after I did that, there was just not any repercussions after that. He let it drop. He just never brought it up again. And when I met Gloria, the principal, in August '83, they really got to like her, and she's a very special person and very intelligent, had an extremely good education, and like my folks, and same nationality background. I think that helped. That kind of helps in that area, meaning Western Pennsylvania. People tend to hang with same nationalities still. And so it was never a problem. We'd go over to my folks' house and we'd sit on the couch together, and I'd put my head on her lap or something like that, and they just never, they handled it just as if it was my sister and her husband or something like that. They just never had a problem after that. So, I think maybe in hindsight too, maybe it was they were happy because at least I was settled down with somebody. Because certainly I came out of that marriage thinking, well, there's got to be a guy somewhere for me. And, initially it just wasn't, although it seemed like here, because Bill was the long-standing, it wasn't just Bill that I dated initially. And so it was like, who's knocking on the door next type thing. So I think I think it just worked. And I mean, Gloria really became in a way the dad that Mark never had. My son Mark. Yeah, and she was also very good to Stephanie. The kids, Stephanie elected to go live with her dad when she was almost 12. And I guess I felt guilty enough from tearing her out of her school and her friends when I did, that I let her go back. And then of course it was kind of like, then we just let the kids, I had Mark and he had Stephanie, and the kids would be together every weekend, either with me or with their dad. But the weekends that we had the kids, we'd always be doing something special. Gloria was great with kids, absolutely wonderful with kids. And we'd be going to, the Football Hall of Fame, or we'd go on a picnic, or we'd be going here, or we'd go to a baseball game. She's a great sports fan. And she's a wonderful golfer. She taught Mark how to golf when he was like 7, maybe younger, I don't know. And we'd go to the tournaments, that whether it was the PGA or the LPGA tournaments. Got to meet the golfers. She was also famous for that, autographs. And the kids loved that. She knew how to work autographs just wonderfully. And they met so many people. They met all these famous golfers, and she made sure that they met because she had a respect for the game. She probably should have been a professional at one time, and she was that good. But she made sure they'd meet Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus and all of these famous, role model golfers. And the same with the women, And so it was just a wonderful life for them. She was the first one that ever took Mark to a professional football game in his life. That was his birthday present. And then I went along to the first birthday present football game, froze our cookies off because his birthday's December 22nd, and decided that Gloria and Mark could go to the next games themselves. She graduated from Georgetown University, and she introduced him to the Hoyas and the Hoya basketball team, and John Thompson, who was a famous coach at that time. She would take him to the players' celebration that they have at the end of the year. It was a wonderful life for the kids, and I can't say enough about it, And so it was very accepted by my folks. They saw how she took care of my kids, and I think that was the most important thing for my parents. Is Mark and Stephanie and their education, and of course she was all for education too. So,
How do you believe coming out affected your work life? Or when were you first out in an employment setting?
I was, as I said, I came out to myself in '82, and that first year that I was living with Sheila, it was a little difficult because you have no protection in Pennsylvania for employment. You still don't have any protection for employment, and in school districts, you sign a contract. And the teaching contracts, almost all teaching contracts, at least at that time, have a morals clause. And morality is by whatever the definition that the community holds. and the school board holds. So it was pretty scary. I certainly couldn't afford to lose a job. It wasn't like there was, even though my ex-husband made more money than I did, it wasn't like there was money flowing from him to Mark, because there was an inequity in salaries. So it was like you just, come out in school. You didn't, except for that brief encounter with one of the female teachers, and she went back. I'm not sure that was a relationship that was what I thought it was going to be. I think it was more of a rescuing relationship on my part. I rescued her from this abusive, domestic violent household. And she went back, which often happens, to that household. So it was like, nobody really knew at work, and because I lived 45 miles away from work, it was easy to keep that separate. And so that's kind of how I played it. The one scary time was when I was down in the bar in Fort City, and I bumped into one of my former students, female former students, and I remember her coming up to me and saying, "Oh my gosh, I didn't expect you to be here." Now I think she had, I'm sure it was a former student. She had graduated already, maybe a couple years out of school. So I didn't know you'd be here. And I looked at her and very seriously and said, "I'm not. Don't even go anywhere else with this." And so I think what happened is, even though my life was so separate from my work, there was a couple things that scared me. I knew that as time went on, I'd come out. And you also want to go places with your partner. Faculty has get-togethers with their spouses, and I could never do that. And so I couldn't take Gloria with me anywhere. And the folks, the folks at the Catholic school seemed to love her so much as a principal that was like they either didn't know or didn't want to see it. They knew. Eventually, most people knew we lived together in an apartment. We were living together in a 2-bedroom apartment with a young son. So I knew eventually that I'd have to probably move into a job where I was safer. And then on top of that, unfortunately, Gloria had a problem that I didn't realize at first. And it was getting too close for comfort too, because she would stop at bars and to drink. And she realized that eventually she was going to run into somebody from the church meaning the church the school was attached to. And so she decided to take a job in Lancaster at a school district teaching. Although that wasn't any healthier for her, I guess it was, if you know anything about alcoholism, geographical moves are sometimes the easiest thing to do, in thinking that if you move away, it'll stop. And so she took this job, and I chose what initially, while she was going through the process of taking the job, blinders on, no, she wasn't going to go. And one day I found myself looking around, and indeed she went. And it wasn't that she wanted to break up, but her livelihood was at stake, she felt. So my next move was to try to get a job out in this area. And I started looking for jobs. And it took 3 years before I got a state job. initially the IU job, but then the state job. And luckily I had implemented a program, the student assistance program in my district, and in the neighboring districts I helped them implement it, that some people got to know me, and when I was at training out here, and they used to train for that program out in E-Town at the Masons, and I was told about this regional coordinator's job, which is in charge of like 8 counties or 7 counties, whatever they were at the time, 6, and you would work with all the districts within those counties. So I got that job, and I moved out here. And we tried to get it back together, but it was too difficult by then.
Well, what about in your work life then? Did you ever feel comfortable after you started working at the Department of Ed to be out at work?
Oh yeah. I mean, not initially because I still had another problem of coming out full force, and that is that I was still a mother of a son I had custody of, who was 12 years old when I moved him out here in 8th grade. And you can lose. I had probably in that period of time, from the time I was with Gloria, read a lot about custody because I was so afraid of losing Mark. I mean, there were enough cases on the books of lesbian mothers losing their kids, or the judge would rule at the minimum, separate, move out, establish your own place, no contact. So, I mean, I lived with that fear for years. To the extent that I had already spoken to my parents. My mother obviously had family in another country, even though it was communist, but had a niece in Vienna. I would have run with him. Because even though it meant totally leaving Stephanie behind, because it's just like the famous movie Sophie's Choice. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, you have to choose. And even though it was against the law, because I was just so afraid. And then what happened is, so I knew I couldn't really come out totally until he was 18. And so I didn't totally come out at work. Although that I still had, I met somebody in 91. And we ended up living together and building a house together. And he was in probably 10th grade at that time. 9th grade, 10th grade. And, but what happened is when he turned 12, and this was when he was in I'm trying to think of where we were living. I'm trying to picture his room. It wasn't when we were still in Sharon. It must have been when we were still in Sharon.
What happened?
I'm not sure, but Mark came home from visitation with his father, and he was visibly upset. I was always very close to him. Visibly upset. Something had happened. Something disturbed him. I couldn't figure out what it was. Well, Steve was very bright. He knew he would, and he was also, maybe he didn't want to pay for a custody case, since he had paid for the one and he lost. And he had told Mark, I said, Mark, what's wrong? And he said he didn't want to talk about it first. And then I asked him a little while later, what's wrong? And he said, well, my father told me something. And I said, well, what did your dad tell you? Now this was over, he had already been the experience of living with Gloria, being very close to Gloria. We were living still in Western Pennsylvania. I know that because he was modeling at the time. He decided he wanted to model.
Mark, your
Mark,
son?
my son decided wanted to model when he was 10, so he's like 11, almost 12 when this happened. And so I said to him, what happened? And he said, my dad told me that you were homosexual, and that was bad. And although he knew that Gloria and I loved each other, and that we had never hidden the word gay or, away from him, because we wanted him to know that there were different people that were in this world. And, but without defining it, okay, specifically. But of course, Steve defined it as ugly as he could. And that this was wrong and it was against the Bible and all of this. And I said, oh. And the second part of it was, and he told me that's why your marriage broke up. Which wasn't true. And I figured, well, I could face that one first. And he never said, are you gay? Are you homosexual? He didn't use the word gay. He said, are you homosexual? He never said that to me. He never asked me. Mark.
Okay.
And so he said to me, I said to him, well, Mark, I don't think it was right for your dad to bring you into why we got divorced. Because that was between us, and we both love you. You weren't part of that, and you shouldn't have to deal with that at your age. That's between us. And I said, and then dealing with, well, let's deal with the word homosexual. And I said, well, do you know what that means, homosexual? And obviously somewhere he picked it up and said, yeah, Mom, I think it's when somebody loves somebody else and it's the same sex. I said, yeah, that's right.
And he was only 12.
He was 12. And I said, well, what do you think of that? What do you think of that idea? And he said, I think anybody should be able to love who they want, Mom. And that was his response. He didn't ask me any more beyond that. I said, well, that's a pretty good answer. Or a very good answer. And I just let it go, because I felt that if he wanted to take the next step of saying, are you gay or are you homosexual, he would have asked me directly. I mean, this kid was right on target, and he wasn't, this is now my lawyer kid. So he would have asked. And then, as I said, he was modeling, and I would take him, I would actually take him down to Pittsburgh to go to lessons on how to model runway and all that stuff. And so we would always have something to eat, either before or after his lesson. And we walked into this restaurant at that time, and I said, and he walked by, as you walk by to get your table, and he said, Mom, are those two guys over there gay? I said, I don't know if they are or not. They could be. Maybe they're together, maybe they're not. I have no idea. And he said, oh, okay. And then I thought, well, let's see. If he's asking who's gay, I said, well, who do you know that's gay, Mark? Who do you know that's, yeah. I just said you used the word gay at that time. And he said, oh, well, you know Martina Navratilova, and people he had seen on that we would talk about, in a conversation. He said, oh, and you Gloria. So it was like we got kind of included in the group. And I said, how do you feel about that? He said, oh, Mom, that's no problem. So that was kind of the acceptance. And what also happened back at that day that his father got him into that conversation is he didn't want to go back and see his dad because he didn't want to have to defend me. And so his dad was putting him in a really precarious position for a little boy. And I said, Mark, I think you need to at least tell your dad how you feel about wanting to come over or not wanting to come over, because you should see him, because he does have a right to see you. So if you can do that and you can work something out with him, you should. So he basically called his dad and said, I'm not going to come over if you don't stop talking about my mom, but I'll come over if you do, if you don't do that. But I'm going to live with my mom. And so that was like, then I think Steve backed off because he knew he'd have a hell of a fight if this kid, because the first thing they're going to ask is they're going to look at the situation, the living conditions, of two educated women raising this kid who wants to be there with them, and there's no quote unquote damage or anything. I think he would have had a hell of a fight on his hands. So even though I was afraid, I still knew that where Mark wanted to be and all that. So, and even when I came here and Mark came, he still saw Gloria, even though we weren't together. They still golfed together. They still did all kinds of things together. I mean, she would take him on vacations to these big Pinehurst and all these big golf courses, things that I couldn't do with him. I couldn't afford to do that. So they, she was there in his life,
And then after he turned 18, because you said at that point you no longer had to fear that custody issue, was it soon after that you felt comfortable coming out at work?
I think I just came out gradually. It wasn't like I had a house with a woman. As I said, I built a house with a woman, and we had Christmas parties, and this house was a pretty nice, big house, large house, and a nice development. And so my staff, meaning our staff, which was 8 regional coordinators and the boss and the secretary, we threw a Christmas party, and it's pretty obvious, even though we kind of set up the houses. They used to call it de-diking the house. But even though we had 2 separate bedrooms, it was almost like a house built with 2 separate master bedrooms. But I don't think it was fooling anybody, And I think then finally it just like evolved. I just finally wasn't, too careful about it or something. I didn't try to hide it. I didn't try to throw it out there, but I didn't try to hide it. So I think that's what happened. And it depends on then, relationships and how comfortable the other person is in the relationship and how closeted they are, so.
So is it fair to say that and within a few years of Mark turning to 18 that you felt more at ease, and after having this Christmas party, did you at that point become involved with the gay community at all?
Probably started getting, relationships aren't stable. I have to say that for sure. The woman I had built a house with, at that time I was having to take care of my parents in a way, who were in Western Pennsylvania. My father went through a bout with lung cancer, and at the same time he went through what they call rage dementia. So my mother, who had never been afraid of my father, he did some very angry things that really scared my mom. So I was very much ignoring the relationship and locked into trying to care for my parents, and would travel out to Western Pennsylvania on the weekends. And what I found out is that in 1995, my dad died in December of 95. But that summer and during that fall, she had met somebody. And so after, in 96, she moved out, and it was kind of a nasty separation because of the house. And I was more involved with that and trying to work through that separation. And I didn't, I met somebody finally in late May of '97 and decided to, and because the house was a huge issue, and at that time, it's still in Pennsylvania, you have no protection, really, although I think it's a little better when you go to court and you have your name on the house, even though you're a lesbian couple. I think it's a little bit more fair. But back then it was like, if you can't take care of this house yourself, and it's like whoever grabs it, grabs it. And she ended up deciding just to walk away. And it went into because I couldn't handle it on my own. So it went into foreclosure. Thank God it ended up selling for more than was owned on it. So it didn't hurt me to a great extent or for a long time. But I think I had finally, and by '97, like I said, around June 1st, I finally had it with trying to repair that or live there in that house that was half empty by then, and fell in love with somebody, love at first sight, and decided to move here to Lancaster, into Harrisburg, and then I started getting involved more in the community here. That's when I started getting more involved with
More of an
active,
activist.
yeah. Well, definitely started with the women's circle, and then from there it just bloomed.
How do you feel that coming out affected your spiritual life? How did it impact?
I don't think initially, I went to my dad's church because I really wasn't out that much, and so as long as I stayed there, I sort of went there. But I also then I had a conflict because my son was going to a Catholic school, so I would attend Catholic Mass, and actually finally I decided to convert to Catholicism because it was such a conflict of going both places. And then it wasn't a good fit, but it was giving him what I felt was what he needed. And then when I moved to Lancaster, he was going to a Catholic school still. He graduated in '95. So up until the time he graduated, I just attended Mass with him when we did. And he was an altar boy in the whole 9 yards. And then when I moved here to Harrisburg, I was seeking a church that was gay-friendly. And lo and behold, I heard about a church in a Lutheran church, which was unusual to have a gay-friendly Lutheran church, St. Michael's. And I heard about this pastor that was there, Russ Mueller, who to this day I think is, I guess we can have words of saying I really just think he's a great man. And not only that, he was on the Common Roads Board at that time. Mm-hmm. And so I got to know that church more, and I joined that church, and I got very involved with that church for a while. And so I didn't have any conflict at all because there were a lot of members that were gay in that church. And matter of fact, Russ performed a commitment ceremony while he was still at that church. And he could have literally been bounced out of the church. But he felt, because he had been a minister so long and he was about to retire, it was kind of like, what are they going to do? And I love that attitude. What are you going to do? So, but I even went so far as when I was part of St. Mike's, I went and I represented St. Mike's had what they call a synod meeting. Synodical meeting is when there's a synod is a group of churches in a certain area, and they meet in Gettysburg. And I went down there, and the church at that time, the Greater Lutheran Church, was considering gay and lesbian ministers. And there was a big controversy about that. The synods were voting for or against it. And I've had a lot of public speaking, but this was still a pretty scary thing to get up in front of a synod with the head of the synod presiding, and I spoke for them passing that and why they should pass it. So I didn't see a clip in being gay and my spiritual life. I felt that I really I took to the idea that Christ didn't condemn anyone. That when he wouldn't condemn the poorest of souls, no matter what they did. He would always forgive. He always taught love. And I just couldn't come to grip with a God that was, going to bring hell and damnation on people because they loved somebody. Might be a lot of things that you go to hell for, but it's not because you love somebody of the same sex. And so it just never was a conflict for me. And I tried to fight for the rights anywhere I could, whether it was in the church or in the community.
But you left St. Michael's then?
I left St. Michael's, but it had nothing to do with left. He retired, which was deeply affected me. Although I stayed on and still was continuing, as I said, as a lay minister, the whole 9 yards. But what happened is when Russ left, they got a new minister, and he's a great guy. He's a really nice guy, Larry. I call all these ministers by their first name because I think it's because my father, when you grow up with a minister for a dad. But what happened is many of the people that didn't like Russ came back to the church, sort of took it over.
Okay.
And a lot of those folks, even if they were even gay or straight, it was like if they were gay and coupled, they didn't recognize their relationship as being coupled. And so that was hard. It wasn't as open. Didn't feel as good to me. And when I said to myself, this isn't a comfortable place for me anymore. So I decided to stop going, I guess, and find another church. But I haven't. I've gone to the MCC church. One of the things I was asked to do for 4 years in a row is I put together the service after Pride, the Sunday service after Pride. And I put that together for 4 years, and it was quite a service. And I would bring as many churches, gay-friendly churches, into it, and as many faiths as I could get. So and at one time I even felt that I might go to the seminary. I checked out I found out that the Lutheran seminary in Philadelphia is actually pretty open to the idea, although Gettysburg Seminary isn't, which isn't a surprise around here. And the Lutheran theological school in Lancaster is very friendly to couples. I even went for an orientation once, and I mean, out of the 10 people that were there, probably a third of them were gay. So, but I guess my life has taken into an activist mode now instead.
Speaking of the activist mode, and of course, you referenced much earlier in the interview, the very historic decision last week from the United States Supreme Court in finding a provision of the federal DOMA law unconstitutional. So you certainly have witnessed and in fact participated in a lot of activists venues to help bring about things and changes. However, the one question I do want to ask you is, what challenges do you think the gay community still has before us?
Oh, the big thing is the state-by-state recognition of same-sex marriage. That's the next big agenda item. There's no doubt about it. There's one, I was so emotionally overwhelmed when I had heard that DOMA went down, because it just isn't right to have all those rights and you get married and you don't have them. I mean, it's like second-class citizenship. And then I was talking to Ted Martin about it when I got to the center, and what I didn't realize is that you couldn't, because of course I didn't read the whole thing, I was just so elated about the thing that day, is you couldn't get married in another state and bring that federal recognition. I don't care about the state recognition. I don't care about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania doesn't want to recognize it. So be it, fine, but bring those federal rights here with you, which I don't understand, because if a heterosexual couple gets married in New York, they certainly are married in Pennsylvania. So I think state by state, that's going to be the ball game. It's going to fall. And I think I heard the judge that had decided Prop 8, and that's what he said too. I listen to a lot of and read a lot about this issue and about gay issues and gay rights, and it's just like it was a domino effect when it came to interracial marriage. It'll be a domino effect when it comes to gay marriage, same-sex marriage. It'll go state by state by state. They, meaning the activists, are already targeting the easiest states. People are going to get married in other states and go back to their home state and sue their states, governments, to say, you can't stop me. I think that's one way. I think the other thing is the same thing. One of the reasons I wasn't too surprised in one way that DOMA went down is that once Don't Ask, Don't Tell went down, how can you possibly tell service people? And my son's in the reserves, Air Force Reserves. He's a JAG, okay? How can you possibly tell a service person that they're going to, you no longer have to, you can be gay in the service, but we're not going to recognize your relationships. We're not going to recognize if you're married in a state that you're married in. You can't have any of those rights. You can't bring your spouse on the base and live with that person. Go into the PX. Your spouse can't go into the PX and buy at that store. That's nonsense. And there was just no way that I felt that the government or the Supreme Court was not going to take that into consideration. All these service people, And since Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I mean, people have been coming out service-wise, a lot. And they can't, I couldn't see how they could continue that. And I think the thing is with the military that's going to change this state issue. Because if a person is married and lives in New York State, I can use New York State, and they're in the service, and they get involuntarily transferred, because they get transferred from the base here to the base in Texas, let's say, okay, San Antonio, where my son was stationed, and then they're going to say, oh, you're no longer married here, even though we brought you here. They're not going to put up with that. The military is going to be a big issue. and then the individual people that are willing to take on their state by state, and I think they're going to fall. The problem is, I think Pennsylvania is going to be one of the last states to fall. And I think the big issue with Pennsylvania, and I totally agree with Ted, is you've got to get the equality law passed first. There's no way they're going to give a right to marry and recognize your marriage. If they don't, if you can still get fired, if you can't get accommodations in a hotel, if you can get asked to leave a restaurant, you can't possibly have, get the greater prize without getting the small prize first.
Makes sense.
And so I don't mean it's equality as any. You've got to work by the biggest issue first, and that's the equality issue. And you asked me before if I was ever going to retire, or when I'm going to retire. People say, my son says, I'm retired already. But the thing is, I've told Ted, and I don't know if he'll take me up on it, that once I retire, and if I'm still in Pennsylvania and not in North Carolina, that, God forbid, go from one state to another state that's just as bad, that I would to work for him and volunteer for him for equity, because equality PA, because I really feel that I could do something in that realm. I feel very comfortable speaking to people in our legislature. I have already on other issues such as the teacher's pension issue. I was actually asked last year to run
For what?
for Jeff Picola's office.
That would be the House, Pennsylvania House.
Senate.
Pennsylvania Senate.
And believe me, I was flabbergasted. But it was because Rod Templets had been redistricted out as one of the redistricting. And he had already been preparing this for a year or two. He wanted that position. But they didn't know what to do after he was redistricted out. And I guess I got a call one night. I don't exactly know what happened, but I just got a call one night from the Democratic Senate Committee, and they asked me if I'd consider running. They explained to me what happened, and I was so flabbergasted that the first thing I said, which was just to me like totally like duh, is I said, "Well, you realize I'm openly gay, don't you?" Because to me that would be a problem. And their response on the phone was, because there was like 4 people on the phone, "Yeah, that's exactly why we want you." So, and they said my name kept coming up and up and up in conversation, which I'm thrilled about, that anybody would even know who I am at that level. And what I responded is, because I wasn't ready for retirement at that time, and I would have had to give up my job. Civil service, you can't work and run for office. The minute you sign petitions, you're done, And I wrote to Senator Leach, and I told him that I really was honored and that this is why I couldn't resign. But I said, I'd be very honored if he took a look at me after I retired. But it's that or any other position that I'd consider running. But it's tough. I saw Kelly run, and it's hard. It's really hard. Kelly McEntee run for representative against Marsico. It's tough. There's a real, it's just a huge stump in this area. It's huge to try to get elected if you're a Democrat because of the representatives area in highly Republican area.
Okay. I want to ask you in closing, is there anything else that you want to say that wasn't asked, or that you feel you'd like to leave as the last message on your interview? Words of inspiration or hope or anything that you would like to say in conclusion?
I don't think I ever dreamt that gay rights would go as far as they have so fast. I remember going to the first gay rights march. Not the first one in Washington, but the first one I went to. I think it must have been in 84 or 85. And seeing when you enter in something like that and you see all those people, and you know that there's a huge number of people out there like you, but everything is against you. I never dreamt that we'd get this far this fast. And I just think, I just hope that the movement will continue, it will be strong, and that just like in the movement for women's choice, that young people have to step up to the plate and take our spots, because we can only be there so long, and we get tired.
Right.
You know, those of us who have been, you know, and around for a while doing this, and now in our 60s, like I am, and just take those spots and get out there and, you know, fight for those spots. You believe in it. You believe in equality. The young people today are great. Now just, you know, go out there and see what you can do to continue this fight for equality.
Okay, well, thank you.